London, January 30th, 1649. A man was putting on a second shirt, not because he was cold, though he was. The winter of 1649 was one of the sharpest in memory, the Thames frozen solid, the streets of London turned to iron under the January frost. A second shirt made sense on a morning like this, but that was not why he was putting it on. He was putting it on because in 2 hours he was going out in front of a crowd of thousands, and he did not want anyone to see him shiver. Not because shivering would kill him, he was going to die regardless, and he knew it and had known it for days, but because shivering might look like fear, and if it looked like fear, people might think he was afraid of death, and the King of England was not afraid of death. He said so himself in the careful, deliberate language of a man who'd been thinking about how this moment would be remembered. The season is so sharp as probably may make me shake, which some observers may imagine proceeds from fear. I would have no such imputation. He put on the second shirt. He ate a small breakfast, bread and wine. He said his prayers, and at 10 in the morning he walked out of St James's Palace under armed guard, past the ceiling paintings of his father looking down from heaven toward the scaffold at Whitehall where the axe was waiting. He was 50 years old. He had been King of England for 24 years. He'd started a civil war that killed 250,000 people. He'd lied to his captors, invited a foreign army to invade his own country, refused every compromise his opponents offered, and maintained with a consistency that bordered on the supernatural that everything he had done was right, because God told him so. This is the story of the man who believed God made him king, and what it cost him, and what it cost everyone else, and the question that his death left unanswered, still unanswered, perhaps permanently unanswerable, about where power actually comes from. On January 30th, 1649, England did something that no European nation had done before, and that the entire political world of the 17th century considered somewhere between impossible and blasphemous. It put its king on trial, found him guilty, and cut his head off. Not in a coup, not in a back room, not in the kind of quiet, convenient death that inconvenient monarchs had been dying for centuries, the mysterious illness, the unfortunate accident, the prison fever that nobody quite believed but nobody quite challenged. In public, in a court, with charges read aloud, witnesses called, a verdict announced, and a sentence carried out on a scaffold in front of thousands of people who stood in the January cold and watched the axe fall. The groan that went through the crowd at that moment, recorded by eyewitnesses, described as a sound unlike anything they had heard before and hoped never to hear again, was not the sound of satisfaction. It was the sound of an entire civilization discovering in the space of a single instant that something it had believed to be permanent was not permanent at all. Kings could die, not just from illness or battle or assassination, from a verdict. And the question that sound contained, the question that the groan of that crowd in January 1649 has been asking ever since, is what exactly had just happened, whether it was justice or murder, whether it was the birth of something new or the distraction of something necessary, whether the men who signed the death warrant were heroes or criminals, whether, in the end, Charles was right.
To understand why Charles I died, you must first understand what he believed, not as a political position, not as a strategic calculation, as a fact of the universe, as fundamental and as unchallengeable as the rising of the sun. The divine right of kings was not, in the 17th century, a theory about governance. It was a theology, the belief that God, the Christian God, the God of the Bible, the God before whom every soul would eventually answer, had personally selected the monarch to rule over his people, and that this selection was expressed through the bloodline, through the institution of monarchy, through the anointing ceremony at coronation, in which the Archbishop of Canterbury placed oil on the new king's head in a ritual that stretched back 1,000 years. To challenge the king was to challenge God's choice. To constrain the king was to constrain God's instrument on earth. To put the king on trial was, as those who did it understood perfectly well, something close to putting God on trial. Charles I had inherited this belief from his father, James I, with the same unquestioning completeness with which he had inherited the crown. It was not something he had examined and chosen. It was simply the architecture of his understanding of the world, the frame within which everything else made sense. He had never expected to be king. His older brother, Henry, athletic, charismatic, everything Charles was not, had been the heir, had been groomed for the role, had been the obvious vessel for the divine appointment that would eventually descend on the Stuart line. Then Henry died of typhoid at 18, and Charles, 12 years old, physically weak, prone to illness, afflicted with a stammer that made public speaking a trial in itself, found the apparatus of divine appointment redirecting itself toward him. God had chosen him. The evidence was irrelevant. The stammer was irrelevant. The weakness was irrelevant. God did not make mistakes. It was this belief, sincere, total, structurally impervious to contradiction, that would make Charles one of the most infuriating men in the history of English politics. Because a man who believes his authority comes directly from God does not negotiate, does not compromise, does not accept that the people across the table from him have a legitimate perspective that he needs to accommodate. He listens politely, he nods, and then he does exactly what God has told him to do, which, in Charles's case, was remarkably consistent with what Charles himself wanted. Parliament discovered this within months of his accession. A conflict between Charles and Parliament was not, at its core, a conflict about taxes or religion or the specific grievances that filled the Grand Remonstrance of 1641 with its 204 separate complaints. Those were the symptoms. The disease was philosophical. Parliament believed in something called popular sovereignty, the idea that the king's power derived from the consent of the governed, that authority flowed upward from the people and was delegated to the monarch, and that a monarch who governed against the interests of his people had forfeited the legitimacy of his rule. This was not, in 1625, a radical or unusual idea. It had been developing in English political thought for centuries, expressed in documents from Magna Carta onward, embedded in the very existence of Parliament as an institution. Charles believed the opposite. Power flowed downward from God. The people did not delegate authority to the king. The king exercised authority given to him by divine appointment, and Parliament existed to advise and assist that exercise, not to constrain it. These two beliefs could not coexist in the same political system. One of them had to be wrong, and neither side was willing to be the one that was wrong. For 4 years after his accession, Charles and Parliament fought over taxes. Charles dissolved Parliament in 1629 and governed alone for 11 years, the personal rule as it came to be known, a period during which he financed his government through increasingly desperate and legally dubious means that generated increasingly desperate and legally justifiable opposition. The crisis came from Scotland. A religious dispute over the form of worship Charles tried to impose on the Scottish Church produced a war that Charles could not finance without parliamentary support. He called Parliament back with hat in hand. Parliament presented its 204 grievances. Charles's response was characteristic. In January 1642, he walked into the House of Commons with armed soldiers and attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament for treason. He arrived to find the chamber already warned and the members gone. "I see all the birds have flown," he said to the stunned assembly. It was the last time a reigning British monarch entered the House of Commons. The tradition holds to this day. The Civil War began that summer. 250,000 people died in the English Civil War, more as a proportion of the English population than died in the First and Second World Wars combined. Villages were burned, families were divided. The particular brutality of civil conflict, the knowledge that the man killing you might be your neighbour, your cousin, the man you sat next to in church last Sunday, settled over England for 9 years and left marks that did not fade for a generation. Parliament won. Under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, a Huntingdonshire farmer turned military commander of extraordinary tactical ability and personal conviction, a man whose own beliefs about God's will were as absolute as Charles's, just pointed in a different direction. The parliamentarian forces defeated the royalist armies in the field. Charles surrendered to Scottish forces in 1646. The Scots handed him to Parliament. And then Parliament didn't know what to do with him. Charles in captivity was, if anything, more dangerous than Charles at liberty. He negotiated with Parliament while secretly promising Scotland a religious settlement and a king's ransom in exchange for invasion. He smiled and nodded at the table while Scottish armies crossed the border. He treated the blood spilled in Parliament's name as an abstraction, the cost of doing business, the necessary price of restoring the proper order of things. Parliament fought a second civil war, won it, and looked at the man in their custody who had just invited a foreign army to invade England rather than accept any limitation on his authority whatsoever. Cromwell, who had once watched Charles play with his children and called him the most upright and conscientious man in the three kingdoms, arrived at a conclusion. The king had to go.
Westminster Hall, January 20th, 1649. The crowd was so large that witnesses had to shout to be heard over the noise. The charge was read: high treason, levying war against his own kingdom, tyranny, murder, rapine, violence against the liberty and peace of his people. Charles laughed. Not from contempt, though contempt was present. He laughed because the charges were, by the logic of the world he inhabited, genuinely absurd. Treason was violence against the sovereign. He was the sovereign. How could the sovereign commit treason against himself? But his response, when it came, was not laughter. It was a question. I would know by what authority, I mean lawful authority, I am brought here. The judge, John Bradshaw, dodged the question. Charles pressed it. Bradshaw dodged it again. Charles pressed it again. The exchange that followed was the most philosophically significant courtroom dialogue in the history of English law, a debate about the nature of power conducted between a man who believed power came from God and a court that believed power came from the people, neither side able to fully articulate its position, both sides talking past each other with the specific escalating frustration of people who do not share enough common ground to actually argue. Charles understood what he was doing. By refusing to enter a plea, by insisting on the question of authority, he was exposing the court as exactly what it was, a body convened under no established legal precedent, acting under no constitutional authority, exercising a power that it had claimed for itself by force and justified after the fact. If power without law may make law, I do not know what subject in England can be sure of his life, liberty, or property. The tyrant had become the constitutionalist. The king who had imprisoned aristocrats for refusing loans, who had dissolved Parliament to avoid its constraints, who had invited a foreign army to invade his country rather than accept any limitation on his authority, this man was now standing in a courtroom arguing for the rule of law. He was not wrong. The court had no legal foundation. The charges were constructed. The verdict was predetermined. Cromwell had spent days before the trial cajoling, threatening and bribing enough signatures onto the death warrant to constitute a majority, just barely, 59 names. The sentence was death by decapitation.
Charles requested one final hearing, was refused, was dragged from the court. As he was escorted out, a member of the crowd pushed through the guards and spat in his face. Charles wiped it away with a handkerchief. "Well, sir," he said quietly, "God hath justice in store for both of us." The sentence has been read. Charles Stuart, tyrant, traitor, murderer, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. He has 3 days, and what he does with those 3 days tells you everything about who he actually was. Subscribe to Dash History. Don't miss the end. January 29th, 1649. Charles's 2 youngest children were brought to St. James's Palace to say goodbye to their father. Elizabeth was 13 years old. Henry was 9. Charles had always been, whatever else he was or was not, a devoted and affectionate parent. Cromwell himself had noted it, watching the kin at play with his children in easier times. Elizabeth was devastated. She could not be consoled. For the hours of the visit, Charles tried everything he knew to offer comfort to a 13-year-old girl who understood, with the specific comprehension of a child who has been told something she could not yet fully process, what was going to happen to her father the next morning. He told her to remember certain things, to forgive his enemies, to tell her brother, the Prince of Wales, that his father forgave him too, though for what he did not specify. He gave her a Bible. When the time came for the children to be taken away, Charles ran after them for one final embrace, and then they were gone. The composure he had maintained through weeks of captivity, through the trial, through the verdict, through the sentence, all of it left him at once. He collapsed onto the floor of his chamber in tears. He spent the rest of the day alone. He put on the 2nd shirt in the morning. The scaffold at Whitehall had been built while Charles slept, moved to that location specifically so the noise of its construction would not disturb the king's rest. The executioners wore disguises, not masks exactly, but false beards and altered clothing. They would not show their faces. Charles, who had never in his life encountered a situation in which he did not feel entitled to answers, asked why. "Are you afraid to kill your king with an open face?" No answer. He asked about his hair, whether his long hair would trouble the axe's path. Told yes, he put on a nightcap, and the executioner helped tuck his locks beneath it. Even here, in these final minutes, the specific grammar of his authority persisted. The executioner helping the king with his hair, the king directing the executioner about the sign to strike. He turned to the crowd to deliver his final speech. Almost no one could hear him. The soldiers surrounding the scaffold were too far back and the crowd too large. Only those on the scaffold itself caught his last words, his forgiveness of his enemies, his conviction that a subject and a sovereign were entirely different things, his declaration that he was going from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown. He knelt. He placed his head on the block. He prayed. The executioner, preparing his swing, accidentally brushed Charles's shoulder with the axe. Charles, calm and precise to the last, reminded him to wait for the sign, the outstretched hands he had specified in advance. He stretched out his hands. The axe came down. The groan that followed was heard across London. An eyewitness named Roger described it as a sound he had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. Edward Hyde, a man who had opposed Charles at critical moments, who understood his failures as well as anyone alive, called it a universal groan, as if the world itself had given a sigh. England had just killed its king. And in the silence that followed the groan, the specific weight of what had just happened settled over the crowd, and over the city, and over the country, and over everyone who would hear about it in the days and weeks to come. Something had ended, something had changed, something that had seemed permanent as the order of the universe, as permanent as God's appointment of his representatives on earth, had been demonstrated in one clean axe blow to not be permanent at all. Oliver Cromwell ruled England for 5 years as Lord Protector. He did not take the title of king. He did not wear the crown. He had, after all, signed the death warrant of the man who wore it. But he governed with a thoroughness and an authority that would have been recognizable to any monarch, dissolving parliaments that disagreed with him, ruling by military force when necessary, making decisions by the exercise of personal conviction about what God required. He died in 1658. His son Richard succeeded him and lasted 8 months before resigning. And then Parliament did something that the execution of Charles I had seemed to make impossible. It invited the monarchy back. Charles II, the son Charles I had written to from St. James's Palace, the heir he had tried to prepare, returned to England in 1660 and was restored to the throne. The men who had signed his father's death warrant were hunted down. Some were executed, some fled. The bodies of Cromwell and 2 other regicides were exhumed, hanged in their shrouds, and their heads mounted on poles above Westminster Hall, the hall where Charles I had been tried 11 years earlier. England had killed its king, had governed without a king for 11 years, had discovered that governing without a king produced its own forms of tyranny, and had decided, in the end, that it preferred the familiar tyranny of monarchy to the unfamiliar tyranny of military dictatorship. The monarchy has not been abolished since. This is the detail that the story of Charles I tends to skip past in its rush to the execution, the detail that changes what the execution actually meant. Because if the execution of Charles I had produced a stable republic, the question of whether it was justified would be answered by the outcome. History would have validated the judgment of Parliament in the way that history validates difficult decisions that produce good results. It did not produce a stable republic. It produced Cromwell, and Cromwell produced the Restoration, and the Restoration produced the constitutional settlement that the Civil War had supposedly been fought about in the first place. The same limitation of royal power, the same parliamentary supremacy that Charles I had refused to accept at the cost of 250,000 lives and his own head. The outcome that the Civil War achieved could have been achieved by negotiation in 1642. Charles refused. Was the execution justified? Was it necessary? Was it murder or justice? The English brought the monarchy back. Draw your own conclusions.
Charles I is buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle in a vault beside Henry VIII. No monument marks the spot. The location of his grave was uncertain for centuries and was only confirmed by a Victorian-era examination of the vault. He has no elaborate tomb, no effigy. The man who believed God had placed him on the throne of England lies in an unmarked space beneath a chapel floor. The scaffold at Whitehall is gone. The palace itself burnt down 40 years after the execution. London rebuilt over the site and moved on, the way cities always move on, converting their most dramatic moments into street names and historical plaques and the vague awareness that something important happened here once, details available upon request. What remains is the question that Charles asked in Westminster Hall in January 1949 and that nobody answered to his satisfaction and that nobody has fully answered since. By what authority? Not just Parliament's authority to try him. That specific question was resolved, however inadequately, by the political reality of the Rump Parliament and the signatures on the death warrant. The deeper question, the question about where power actually comes from, about whether a king is accountable to his people or to God, about whether the man on the throne got there by divine appointment or by the collective consent of the governed, about what happens when those two beliefs share a country and cannot be reconciled. Charles died believing God had made him king. He died believing that Parliament's authority was illegitimate. He died believing with the certainty of a man whose certainty had survived everything that contradicted it, the lost wars, the captured children, the scaffold, the axe, that he was right. He was a bad king. He was a rigid king. He was a king whose inability to accept that other people's perspectives had legitimate claims on reality cost 250,000 lives and ended in his own execution on a January morning in a city he was no longer able to rule. But
He was also the man who asked in a court that had no legal foundation by what authority he was being judged. And that question, however inconvenient, however self-serving, however much it came from a man whose own exercise of power had been as arbitrary and as unchallengeable as anything Parliament ever did, was a real question, a necessary question, the question that constitutional government has been trying to answer ever since. Power comes from God, said the king. Power comes from the people, said Parliament. The people disagreed with each other and fought a civil war and killed their king, and discovered that killing their king did not resolve the disagreement and brought the king's son back, and reached, over the following decades, something that might be called a settlement. Not a resolution of the philosophical question, but an arrangement for living with the disagreement without periodically killing each other over it. The English monarchy still exists. The Parliament that tried Charles I still exists in modified form. The constitutional arrangement that emerged from the wreckage of the Civil War and the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 is still the framework within which British political life operates. Charles I is buried under an unmarked floor. The institution he died defending is still alive. Whether that vindicates him or damns him depends on what you believe about where power comes from. England proved that kings could die and then brought the monarchy back. And that contradiction, that specific, unresolved, permanent contradiction at the heart of what happened in January 49 is the thing that the execution of Charles I actually produced. Not a republic, not a revolution, not an answer. A question. The same question he asked in Westminster Hall, still waiting for an answer that satisfies everyone, still dividing the people who try to answer it, still costing, in one form or another, whatever it costs when human beings disagree about where power comes from and cannot find a way to stop. If this story stayed with you, if Charles and the scaffold and the question that still has no answer means something to you, there are more of them waiting. Every empire, every execution, every moment when the world changed and left the question behind. Subscribe to the Dash History and stay.